Hello YouTubers! Welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha and today I'm going to be looking at Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero's seminal horror zombie movie from 1968. George A. Romero died this week. Maybe not the week that you're watching this video, but the week that I'm recording this video. So I thought I'd look at a few of his films. So I'm going to start in the obvious place, which is his debut feature, Night of the Living Dead. And maybe go on and look at some of his other films, Dawn of the Dead especially. I will. That will definitely be my next video, as it's one of my favourite horror movies, maybe my favourite horror movie. And then after that, well, this just arrived just today in the post for me. I've got Day there. And then beyond there, we've got Land and Diary, which I've never seen, and Survival, his sort of latter day trilogy, if you like, which are less connected than the previous trilogy. And I've also prioritised a few of his films on Love Films, so I've got Martin and Creepshow and The Dark Half, films I've never actually seen, so it should be interesting. Whereas with my last marathon session of Peter Jackson films, there was a filmmaker whose output I was very familiar with. George A. Romero, I'm not that familiar with. I have seen some of his zombie movies. One of them is one of my favourite films, and but he's not a filmmaker that I'm familiar with his entire output. So this should be an interesting one. Whereas with Peter Jackson, I very much went into that because he was a filmmaker whose output I really enjoyed and was a big fan of. This is going to be more a series of discoveries, really, for me to see if Romero really lived up to the early promise that he showed with his initial early horror movies. Like I say, I'm only really familiar with his zombie films. I don't think I've ever seen a film of his that wasn't a zombie movie. So this should be an interesting one to go into. So Dawn of the Dead, like I say, was his debut feature. Came out in 1968 and really invented the zombie movie as we know it. Invented the concept of zombies and the rules of the game, and a lot of the things that you now see in zombie movies, the story beats that which are really the cliches of the series. So any horror film aficionado really needs to recognise this as being a seminal movie, because without this you wouldn't have The Walking Dead, you wouldn't have Resident Evil, you wouldn't have Shaun of the Dead or 28 Days Later. This is where it all started. George A. Romero was a commercials director in his 20s, and along with his friend John Russo, they co-wrote a screenplay together. They decided they wanted to do a low-budget horror movie outside the Hollywood studio system, and so that was the starting off point. And their idea was to take inspiration from Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which was a book published in the 50s about the last man on Earth fending off ghouls, basically. In I Am Legend, they're essentially vampires, but Romero came up with a more original invention, which was reanimated corpses. The term zombies isn't actually mentioned in the entire film. He referred to them as ghouls. They got sort of post the event labelled zombies. but zombies are the term zombie really comes from Haitian culture and voodoo, uh, the voodoo religion, and the religion in the West Indies, and it's he never intended for them to be called zombies. That was just labelled what they were labelled by the fans later on. So he always just saw them as ghouls and the reanimated dead, and this malevolent force that the characters in the film had to fend off in for survival, basically. So the basic story of the film is you have Barbara and her brother Johnny. The film opens with them going to visit their parents' grave, and when they're there, they're attacked by somebody who just appears to be a random stranger, a random madman, but later it transpires he's one of the Walking Dead. He kills Johnny. Barbara goes and seeks refuge in a nearby abandoned house, and there she meets various other characters. Initially Ben, a black man who who says that who tells her that basically there's something amiss going on in society now. There's what appear to be people stalking the landscape, and he's having to fend them off, and they're not acting like real people. They've become bloodthirsty, brain-eating ghouls, basically. Various other characters turn up in the house, and it's a fight for survival in there. The film is, it's one of those things where it's regarded as a classic now, but if you go into this, when you go into a film knowing that it's regarded as a classic, you might be taken back slightly by the aesthetic value, because what you've got to remember is this was made to be nothing more than a B movie. It was made to be nothing more than a cheapo thrill ride for the driving audience on a Saturday night, a date movie, if you like. And although interestingly, this film was released several months before the MPAA code was initiated in America, so there was a generation of children who saw this film, 6 or 7 year olds who would have gone along and would have been rightfully traumatized by the film. It might be hard to believe that when you watch this film now, because it is relatively tame by today's standards, but 1968 audiences wouldn't have seen gore on this level before this film was released. And the film is it is psychologically intense. It's there's a real sense of foreboding about the film. There's a real sense of apocalyptic dread, which Romero really excels at in his directing, creating a sense of dread in his work. And so for pre-teens who would have seen this when it initially came out, it must have really been quite an ordeal to sit through, especially given the time it was released. The film is all in black and white, so that kind of lends to the overall sort of look of the film, the overall sort of sense of dread that you get watching it. What's interesting is you see the cliches being invented before your eyes. It's one of those films that everything in it. If you've never seen this film before, when you watch it, you really remark on how familiar it all seems, just because it was ripped off and emulated so much. to a point where everything in this film sort of almost becomes the things you must have in a zombie movie now. You know, you have the excuse me, come on. You have the cliches of them boarding up the windows. You know, you have the apocalyptic news reports. You have warning of mass panic and an impending doom. You have the cliches like a loved one turning into a zombie, and the survivor, the relative of the dead one wanting to protect them, and the big impassioned speech. No, they're not your wife anymore. They're not your daughter. You must realize that. And you also have the cliche of the human characters turning on each other in dire situations, because you realise that when in an apocalyptic situation, all bets are off, and the return to a sort of Neanderthal or a prehistoric way of thinking and acting is really on the cards. Zombie movies are really sort of about man's primal instincts coming to the fore, essentially, and so they're a good metaphor for that. Oh God, you been annoyed? Yeah. The news reports in this film are particularly interesting because something that you get in this that you don't really get in a lot of other zombie movies. Some you do, but not a lot, is the explanation or the possible explanation for the outbreak that's happening. There's numerous reports peppered throughout the film of a satellite crash happening, or it has just happened, and this being a possible explanation, the radiation from space causing the zombie outbreak. And so that's something that's a little unique in this film. You certainly don't get it in other zombie films, or things like The Walking Dead. I don't think there's ever been an explanation or well, at least a concrete explanation for the outbreak. Some you do. Resident Evil gives an explanation, but Shaun of the Dead doesn't. I think Shaun of the Dead even makes a joke of it. They're watching a report at the end, and there's about to be a possible explanation on that's the cat moving the camera, isn't he clever? Getting a possible explanation on the news report, and then them changing the channel at the last minute. This is, like I said, this was Romero's first film, and Romero was a talented director. He excelled in certain things more than others. He was a bright, intelligent guy, and he was good at creating mood. And this film, right from the get-go, it creates mood and a certain ambience. There's a very uneasy feeling you get watching the film, which really sort of builds up the tension. And in all these films, especially Dawn, you get a sense of apocalyptic dread creeping in, and a slow sort of dawning realization that the characters that you're following in this film are essentially doomed. You sort of slowly realize over the course of 90 minutes that there's a good chance that a lot of, if not all, these characters are not going to get out alive. And that really started with Dawn. Really started from the get-go, and then like I said in my Peter Jackson reviews, one of the the great things about horror movies is that their cheapness can be scary sometimes. Because this was a very low budget film, he didn't really have a lot of money to spend on makeup. So the zombies early on were little more than white makeup with dark eyeliner. That's all they had for zombie effects. And then I think they added a little extra stuff, mortician's balms to feed to people's faces as the shoot went on. But basically all he had was a little bit of makeup and some offal for some from the butchers for them to stick in their mouths to resemble them eating human brains, and the actors who could do slow, steady walks. Apparently he directed the zombies just by just saying, just play your dead best person, and that was it. The actors were sort of left to their own imagination from that point on. I mentioned his way with actors because if Romero had a weak point, it was his direction with actors. It was never his strong suit. Debut feature directors, that tends to be a falling down point with a lot of them. They don't tend to know how to direct actors very well, and it's debut features tend to have an emphasis more on the visual and the storytelling maybe, and then figuring out how best to work with actors comes with the later features, and that's where you start getting the better, more confident performances. But Romero never really got over that. He seems to relish in very wooden performances in his films, almost to a great effect. I mean, this film, which he made nearly 20 years later, has some very wooden, stilted performances in it, but they're almost so wooden and stilted and badly delivered that they're almost genius in their own certain way. But I'll get onto that when I get onto my Day of the Dead review. Some people say that there's social commentary inherent in this film, and well, in all these zombie movies. Although I think in the first three of his zombie trilogies, I think the commentary was almost unintentional. I think the social commentary was added after the fact, and then when he got to make Land and Diary, he almost felt obligated to put some sort of form of social commentary into those films, and it feels much more crowbarred and less natural. And I think that's really down to the fact that the social commentary was never intentional. I'll talk about the social commentary in the other films when I get onto them, but what I'm referring to specifically when I say social commentary in this is that the character of Ben, the main protagonist in the film, was initially written as a Caucasian hick cab driver or truck driver, and they couldn't find somebody good enough to play this part, so they got their friend Dwayne Jones, who is an African American actor, to play the role. He then became not a hick truck driver, but an intelligent young man. I don't think his occupation's ever stated. So the main character was an African American in rural America, fending his home with a shotgun, and well, I shan't spoil the ending, but the ending, the end to the film, or the resolution to his character, is really where the what people perceive to be the social commentary came in. Remember, this is 68. You know, it's 3 years after the death of Malcolm X. It was on the cusp of the death of Martin Luther King, which is why I say the social commentary was unintentional, probably because Romero, you know, Martin Luther King would have still been alive when Romero made the film, so there was no way that the connotations of the end of the film could have tied in with the death of Martin Luther King. However, you know, it was the 60s, it was the civil rights, and you know, every great movie really, I think, is somehow of its time. You know, even if it's a period movie or a science fiction movie or a fantasy movie, it's you know, or a cheapo little horror movie. If it's a great movie, it speaks of its time, and Night of the Living Dead, you know, couldn't help but speak of the time it was made, and it's a real sort of window into what the general mood of the nation was like in 1968. Yeah. So there's not really, I mean, not much I can say, because, you know, it's a very simplistic plot. You know, it's people holed up in a house, defending the house, trying to make sure this malevolent force doesn't get in, and you know, it's just really well done. It's the first two acts really seem, they do seem slow by today's standards, but what struck me is when I got into the last half hour of this film now, the structure was really there, and it really pays off, because when you get into the final act, and the characters decide to make a bid for freedom, and basically the fates of the characters are all played out, you realise that the how well structured the first two acts of the film are, because it never feels sort of out of nowhere. You know, all the characters' fates and demises seem perfectly in keeping with what was established in the first two acts, and so there's great setup and payoff in the film, and if you know, if you can pull off setup and payoff in a film well, then you've got a great movie on your hand. Yeah, the third act of this film, it kicks ass. That's all I'm gonna say. Yeah, Night of the Living Dead. It's a public domain film. It's really easy to get your hand on. You know, this is an Elstree Hill Entertainment. It basically, there's a million versions on DVD, because it was public. It's public domain. It was never properly copyrighted by the film execs, which is why you've got a million remakes of it now, and all sorts of fan videos and fan made stuff. You know, out there, and cheapo DVD releases, and much better DVD releases out there, you know, and computerized color versions and all sorts. But if you haven't seen it, and like say you're a student of horror cinema, which I'm not really, to be honest. Horror films were never really my bag. I've sort of grown to appreciate them a little more in recent years, but I was never really a horror movie guy. I was more a sci-fi guy, really, or a comedy guy. but I have grown to appreciate horror movies in recent years, but zombie movies were always my favourite. I was watching zombie movies before the grand resurgence that came post 28 days later, and I was saying, why isn't Hollywood making zombie movies anymore? Because these films are awesome, because they're what I loved about them is that they're kind of a hybrid of horror movies and action movies, in that, because you have the rules about destroying the brain, so it becomes less about how the monster is going to kill uh, the central characters, the protagonists in the film, and more about how the protagonists are going to survive and kill the monster, and that, which is something I find much more interesting and compelling to watch. So that's why I'm a zombie movie fan. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment on Night of the Living Dead. But join me on for my next review, Dawn of the Dead. Why it wasn't called Dawn of the Living Dead or Day of the Living Dead, I don't know. But that will be my next review, and then afterwards I'll do Day, and we'll see how we go. I've got more Romero films on the way to watch, and I'll probably intersperse them. I don't think I'm going to do it all in one go, this Romero marathon. I'll probably intersperse it with other reviews of other stuffs. And maybe save some for Halloween, which is coming up in 3 months. So save something for then to talk about. Because I'd like to do the remakes of Night, Dawn and Day as well. So anyway, waffled on too long, as usual. So I will see you next time, and until then, I shall see you all out there in YouTube land.